All right, you ready?
I'm ready.
All right, so 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. All right, folks, welcome back to the Trauma Therapist Podcast. I'm thrilled to have back Shari Botwin. Shari, welcome.
Oh, thank you so much for having me back. I'm so excited.
You are welcome. I'm excited to have you here. So Shari opened her Cherry Hill private practice in 1996. Prior to starting her own practice, Shari worked at the Renfrew Center in Philadelphia. She provides individual, group, and family therapy with a specialization in treating trauma, abuse, eating disorders, anxiety, and depression. She also provides virtual, individual, and family teletherapy. She holds a master's degree, and her second book, Thriving After Trauma, Stories of Living and Healing, was released worldwide on November 4th, 2019. The updated paperback edition came out on October 11th, 2021. A day before the COVID lockdown, Shari was scheduled to speak on a panel with Judge Rosemarie Aquilina and journalist Abigail Pesta at the Wing in New York City. Tickets sold out within an hour after the event was released to members of the Wing in New York. Shari, what's the Wing? I don't know what that is.
It's a women's nonprofit workspace. Unfortunately, since COVID, it's no longer.
Okay. Shari has been called upon to comment on COVID and PTSD for a variety of international media outlets. She's made feature, live, and taped appearances on The Today Show, NBC Nightly News, MSNBC. Damn, you got it going on. She's conducted seminars and live Zoom outreach for the public, addressing how to manage with all the challenges as our world has turned upside down. Thank you so much for coming back.
Thank you so much for having me.
And I know I asked you this, but what is your mission? Because you are definitely on, you can feel it and see it. What's pulling you to do this?
I think my mission is to instill hope and help people who've lived through all different types of trauma to understand that even though this process can be crazy making, long, so painful, that there's so much hope in being able to acknowledge and face whatever happened to us. So I'm out here trying to say to people, if you can let yourself know it, if you can let yourself understand it, you're going to be able to have such a great life. So I think my mission is really about hope and persistence and the idea of determination and how that can really help you to have the life that you want.
You know, I really appreciate you saying that. And I think in our field, in this field here, and speaking of this topic of trauma, that word is used so often, hope, but and I want to just kind of pause for a second and stop. And when people are hopeless, it is so devastating, and to be able to, I think like you're doing, to instill hope, to be a light in a sense, that is so profound. For people who are hopeless to stop and maybe question, maybe I do have hope. Maybe there is hope in all this. Because a lot of people think when they've become traumatized, when they've gone through interpersonal abuse, how the heck am I going to get through? Can I get through this?
Wow. That's interesting that you say that, because I work a lot right now with people who've been in very abusive relationships with partners. And I was just talking to somebody earlier this week who's relatively new to therapy. And that was one of the questions that she asked me. She asked me, how am I supposed to ever be in a relationship and trust the person that I'm with and trust myself in the choices that I make? And when she said that, I think because I've been doing this now for 25 years and I've worked through some of my own trust issues, I understand exactly where she is. She's sort of at the beginning, but then in my mind, I'm thinking about other patients. I have another patient who was in a very abusive, physically, sexually relationship when she was 17 until she was about 22. And she's getting married next week. She left that relationship. She spent 2 to 3 years in therapy, really just uncovering and dealing with all the hurt that she suffered with this guy. And 2 years after that, she met somebody so different and she's so happy. And we get to celebrate in that work all that work that she did, she can now understand why she felt hopeless, but she can say, just because I felt hopeless doesn't mean that the circumstances were hopeless. And that's what I love about this work, that you can move out of these horrible, debilitating feelings like shame and feeling horrible about yourself to actually feeling worthy of having what you want and what you deserve.
How did you get to that point as a human being? How did you personally get to that point where you were able to kind of move out of that?
I spent a lot of years going to therapy 3 times a week, 4 times a week. I spent years talking about different traumas I suffered as a child. I always would think about, why am I doing this work? My therapist would ask me all the time, what are you fighting for? She would try and help me figure out, what did I want from my life? And I knew that I wanted to be a mom. So I think for me, the transformation of going from being a childhood sexual abuse survivor to getting pregnant at 39, having a little guy at 40, and now he's 10 and a half. And I think that not just getting pregnant, but the process of being his parent, especially the first couple years when he was so vulnerable and so little, I think that's when it really clicked for me that not only did I break the cycle of abuse in my family, which I believe goes back way back generations, but I also get to experience being a mom and facing my fears. Am I going to do the same thing to him that was done to me? Am I going to be able to nurture him? Can I provide safety for somebody besides myself? Because when I was going through the trauma work, I was suicidal. I was so close to going into the hospital so many times because I just couldn't take it anymore. So I feel like I had to learn in my therapy, and this is what I do with patients too. I try to teach people how to create safety in a situation or in emotions that feel completely unsafe. And I think because I learned how to do that, I had a dog, which was so healing for me. And very gradually, and this was over the course of probably 15 years of working on myself and also providing counseling to other people, I realized if I can take care of myself, if I can create that safety, then why shouldn't I be able to do that for somebody else? I can do that. And that feeling that you have when you love a child, or like my patient who's getting married, when you feel trust with your partner and you never felt that before, that for me is the ultimate revenge. That's the key to overcoming and thriving. It doesn't mean that you get over it. It doesn't mean that you don't have flashbacks. This week in particular has been a very difficult week for me. I've been hit with flashbacks. I had what I call shame attacks. The difference is because I've done work for so long, I have resources. I have coping strategies that I know work for me. I speak up. I practice self-care. I don't allow myself to act on those feelings that come with shame. And I gradually push myself out of that. And that feeling, again, every time that you can come out of that and we can plant our feet on the ground and experience connection, loving somebody else, honoring ourselves, it's so, to me, it's so empowering. And I feel like I see this in my work. I see this with patients. I see this with friends, and I can feel it for myself.
When you talked about, creating that safety for your patients and for yourself, we use the example of getting a dog, which I think is a great example. And that one of your patients who said, how the heck am I going to get through this? Give us an example of how you might begin to take the steps to create a safe space for someone, or for them to even get to a point where then they might be able to say, yeah, I might be able to. I mean, because it's one thing, right, for us to talk about all this, and it's another thing to actually do it, for that client to feel that.
Yeah. So I think the way we started was we helped her to speak. She spent sessions speaking, but not just in our sessions, but she started opening up to her very close friends who had no idea. She was journaling. We would do some exercises where she would write down different memories, different times when he sexually assaulted her. And then we would talk about, if you could go back and talk to that person now that you remember then, what would you say to her? We talked about different forms of releasing the pain from her body. So she at one point took self-defense classes. So we would actually talk about how she could picture using those skills in her class to get her boyfriend at the time to get off of her, to better protect herself. So we kind of did all that, but we also, and I think this is very important, we took time to figure out how to help her to grieve for that Courtney that spent 5 years of her life living this horrible secret. She was in therapy with me while she was being sexually assaulted by this guy. We met when she was 17 and she came to me because she had an eating disorder. I had no idea that something was going on with her boyfriend. So we had to then go back and help her grieve the part of her that felt scared, the part of her that felt abandoned, the part of her that felt like it was her fault. I think you need to be able to do that. I think when you move past the shame and you realize this was not me, this was the other person who was crazy or debilitated or pathological, then you can move into a place of self-compassion and doing things for yourself that you weren't able to do during the actual trauma. So I think that was the next piece. And one of the things that I want to say is it's different for everybody. What I needed, what Courtney needed, what the patient that I was talking about last week needed, everybody needs something different because usually most of us have dealt with multiple traumatic events, and not all like horrible events, but sometimes traumatic in the sense where we felt shamed, we felt disbelieved, we felt stranded. So I think, people will say a lot, it's so complicated. Trauma recovery is so complicated, and it really is. Again, I don't think it's hopeless, but it's multi-layered. It's in our brains, it's in our hearts. Our bodies store so much of the memory that this whole process of pulling the story together and figuring out, what did I feel in my body? What did I feel in my heart? What kind of thoughts did I tell myself? To kind of very gradually be able to address each of those pieces. But while you're doing that, you have to keep connected to why you're doing that. You're not doing that to feel pain. You're doing that because you want to have a better life. Courtney wanted to be in a good relationship. I wanted to be a mom. This other young woman who's adorable and so talented, she wants a family. She wants to be able to get married. She wants to be able to have kids. So staying connected to the vision of what the outcome will look like when we face things that feel impossible to deal with, that's the key, I think.
When you talked about that one client who came to you, with an eating disorder, trauma wasn't even on the table at that point. And granted, I realize it's different for everybody, but do a lot of the people who come to you for different reasons? And
it's so interesting because the longer I do this work, I've realized that when I get a call, somebody will call and say, I'm struggling with body image issues, or I'm struggling with depression. Do you work with people who have OCD? And when I get the initial call, I say to myself, well, there's probably more to the story. Earlier in my career, I would think, oh, okay, so here's somebody that wants to work with me that just has issues with her boyfriend, or she gets homesick at college, or she struggles with weight shifts or body image issues. At this point, what I say to myself is, I wonder what really brings somebody to my office. And I make sure that I don't ask it in that way, because I think if somebody had said to me, well, do you have any history of trauma, or have you ever been sexually abused? A lot of times on intake forms, when I worked at the Eating Disorder Center, they ask you a list of questions. They want to know what brings you to treatment. And that would always be one of the questions. There's no way that I would have ever answered that. If I had said to Courtney at our third session, is your boyfriend like good to you? Do you have any trauma? She would probably be so put off and I think scared. So I think that it's so common that People go to therapy for a variety of reasons. If you're calling a therapist because you struggle with depression, there's usually something else going on. There are cases where I work with somebody, and I'm thinking of somebody now who doesn't have a trauma history, but she has a significant, more biochemical depression. So we are not talking about sexual assault or abandonment or awful things that happen to people. So in that particular case, that's unique at this point in my practice. I would say 90% of the people that I have met in the last 25 years ultimately uncover some type of trauma.
We talked a little bit before we started recording about the first time you and I talked was like right before COVID hit.
Yeah.
How has this impacted your trajectory and your experience, both personally and professionally?
I mean, it's such a hard question because I feel like it's a head spinner. On the one hand, I think it was so traumatic. It was so isolating. I think the first several months of COVID, that feeling of like not being able to put our arms around people or feeling disconnected from friends, having my little guy like sitting on a sofa doing Zoom classes and my heart breaking because he's not with his friends. I'm trying to work. What I've come to learn as we've gone through this, what I call COVID crazy, is there are some silver linings. So what I've noticed with patients is it hasn't stopped them from working through their trauma. The pandemic has triggered them, but in a way, this is the way I look at it. If we're triggered, there's usually something that we want to work through. We're not triggered for no reason. So once we can identify what's triggering you in this experience, is it the isolation? Is it the fear of getting sick? Is it the financial insecurity? Like what are the triggers? Once we identify that, then we can go back and look at the older traumas and kind of figure out how to help that person move through another part of their recovery. And what I've seen, and I wrote about this in the paperback, the updated paperback, is some people have actually been taking more risks, saying, you know what, I can't stay in this relationship with this person because now I'm with this person, every day, every night, and it's not good. Or I have patients who were in really bad work environments that were triggering a lot of dysfunction from their families. And I've seen people through the pandemic say, enough, I'm done, and like leave their job. I've seen people become more vulnerable and realize that you can be vulnerable and not be taken advantage of. So it's sort of like I hate to use the word good and bad, but there's the good parts, there's the bad parts, but really ultimately, I think as a whole, collectively, we're more willing to talk about things that deal with mental health as a society. There's less stigma about asking for help. And I think there's also the idea that being vulnerable, you can do it and not get hurt. I think I'm seeing more and more people in my personal life, in my professional life, in my own life, I'm seeing there's shifts in that. And that's a good thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, just quickly, so you're referring to your book, Thriving After Trauma, and that just came out in paperback, and you've made some edits to it. Talk a little bit about those.
So what we did when the publisher decided to put the book out in paperback was they asked me to write about the last couple years. They asked me to talk a little bit more about COVID. They asked me to talk about things like racism and political upheaval and just the world and how unsafe it feels. And what I did it's the afterword, is I wrote about the connection between the life events that we've been going through and how they connect with older traumas, whether it's sexual assault, combat, dealing with serious illness. So I pulled everything together. And what I tried to do in that part of the book was I tried to help people see the benefits or the hope that when we live through something horrible, if we can take that horrible whatever and turn it into something that's also hopeful, then we can live with whatever happened to us. So I gave examples from the last 2 years in that part of the book so that people could see the transformation that's happening during the last couple of years.
So you feel that obviously COVID, as you said, is crazy, but there is kind of a silver lining through this. I mean, we are going through a collective trauma. And I think, as you said, people are more and more openly talking about mental health. And it is becoming, I'm thinking of the tennis player Naomi Osaka and the gymnast. What was her name? What is it?
Simone Biles.
Simone Biles.
She was just on the Today Show today. She gave such a great interview.
Did she? Yeah, more and more is coming out. Do you see, where do you see yourself in this? I mean, obviously you've written a book in part about this. Do you see yourself as opening the light on this in a sense? Because you are, if I may say, Shari, I mean, you've got so much passion. I can feel it through this Zoom thing we're on here. And where do you see yourself in this topic, in this moment?
I see myself making more progress when it comes to how would you say that? Liberating myself from layers of shame that still get activated and fears about intimacy that I still have not overcome. I see myself moving ahead in that part of my life. And I think, when you have a 10-year-old, I'm a single mom. I have a 10-year-old. That's different than when you have a 4-year-old. He comes home from school. He'll come home in an hour and he'll be out the door 5 minutes after he gets home from school. So it's like, I see him, I don't see him. Like there's more and more time again where I'm forced to sit with myself and my own feelings. So what I want to do, I'm actually working on another book that's more specifically connected to childhood trauma, because that is obviously something that is so close to me. There are some differences when you go through trauma before you've fully developed versus if you've been in combat at age 30 or you were diagnosed with some serious cancer at age 40. There are some deep-seated wounds that come from having trauma as a child. So I see myself actually sitting down and writing that book. The thought of doing that is so painful and scary for me, but I can feel myself getting closer to doing that. And I think that what will happen is that will help me to get rid of some of these fears and also just get more, I still have work I need to do. So it's going to help me to work through some of this stuff that's still kind of lurking and looming. And what I see in terms of my work life is I think I'm going to just continue to meet more and more people who are going to want even more than what they have now. I feel like the possibilities for our lives are endless. If we want more, or we feel like there's more work we want to do, we can be doing that the whole time we're here on Earth.
What I really appreciate about you is, you're sitting here, you've written a book, you've been on TV, NBC, and you openly talk about your own challenges, your own struggles. It just feels so truthful and organic and genuine to me. And I think so many of us can relate to that.
I think it's so important. It's not even like I have to think about it. I just know that in order to really be able to do this work, I need to bring myself to the work. And I don't sit in sessions and talk about what happened to me. What I do is I tap into the feelings that I feel like the person is having, even through a screen now when we're doing this teletherapy. And I use my experiences to try and help other people. And I'm constantly trying to figure out what is it that I'm still struggling with, or what else is left. Because sometimes people say to me, you have like all your stuff together. You go on TV, you write a book. And I say, yeah. And I also have shame attacks. And I also sometimes feel really hopeless. And sometimes I just want to give up. That's just, why should I not speak that, right? There's, where we live in Philadelphia, there's a football player, and I can't remember his name, but he was out on personal leave the last couple of weeks. We're in Philly, so it's on the Eagles. He just openly talked about how he needed to take 2 weeks because he was having a bout of severe depression.
Oh.
That's where we're at. And
right.
why shouldn't you be able to say that? So for me to be like, oh, I'm a trauma thriver and I'm recovered. No, I'm a trauma survivor who is thriving and who is fighting like hell to live the life that I want. It is not easy, and it requires a lot of attention, a lot of work, a lot of self-care. And it's not something that was given to me. It's something that I work towards, and it's not always pretty. There are days that suck, especially in Alaska. There are days that suck. And sometimes I
Right.
say that, like, I don't go into session with patients and say, today really sucks, but
Right.
sometimes it does.
Right.
And why shouldn't, like, that's just part of the reality of being in recovery. And if you're a therapist and you're trying to help other people go through their battles, we're people too, right? We have things that happen to us. And I think that's what makes a good therapist, not how many classes they took, how many certificates, but how willing they are to look at their own stuff and take responsibility for what's theirs and continue to work on that so they can better help other people.
Love it. Well said, perfectly said. But let me ask you this. How hard or challenging was it for you to get there as a therapist?
I mean, there were days when I thought there's no way I'm going to be able to do this. I would just sit in my office in a ball and just be hysterically crying because would be having flashbacks. I had a session for myself. I was going to be working, and I just kept saying to myself, you've got to keep fighting because there's things that you want to do for your life. There's things that you care about. There's people out here that love you and need you and want you to be okay. So it's hard for me to answer because it was such a roller coaster ride. There were times when I felt so uplifted and hopeful. And then there were weeks where I thought, I can't do this. I would say that all the time. I can't do this anymore. But I think, again, what kept me going was what telling myself why I'm doing this. Why are you doing this? Why are you fighting? Why are you sitting here hysterically crying, but you're not hurting yourself? Because there's people out here that love you, because there's things that you love, because you want to be a mom, because you want to write a book. Because at that point, I hadn't written the book that I just wrote a couple years ago. And I would call people, I'd call my friends who were therapists and say to them, I can't do this anymore. And they would say, yes, you can. And they would sort of stand around me. That's the other thing. I tried to create a lot of images, and I did this during COVID too, where I imagined people that I loved and loved me standing around me, sort of holding me up. That was an image. And I had, specific people, mentors, my therapist, some of my very close friends. Now I have my 10-year-old in that circle sometimes, because like the dude needs me to like go to a soccer game and he wants me to buy him pizza and cheesesteaks for dinner and all this stuff. So I try and keep my supports in my heart, in my mind. And I use that as an uplifter. It really helps.
Awesome. Shari, what's next for you? You talked about another book.
Yeah. So I am going to write this book. I have started to write it, and then I go, I can't do this. This is so hard, but I'm going to write this book. I decided I'm turning 51 in a few weeks. And I said, by the time you're 53, you're going to be done that book. So I'm going to write that book, and I'm going to continue to face some fears when it comes to intimacy and relationships. And I'm going to love every second of being a parent, because I think it's the most, well, this doesn't make sense. This is not correct grammar, but I think it's the funnest thing in the world. So I'm going to continue to work on being present as my kid goes from sort of like pre-teen to teenager. And I'm going to just try and have a lot of fun and be grateful for the things that have come into my life, and continue to come out here and talk to different people. I mean, the work that you do is amazing. And I know that you're making a huge impact on people. And I love connecting with people who have similar goals, because it makes me feel like I'm not the only one.
I appreciate that. Look, you are incredible. How do people get in touch with you?
Okay, so this is when I laugh, because somebody said to me once, what are your social media handles? And I said, what does that mean? I do know what that means now. So people can come to my website, which is just my name, which is just www.sharibotwin, warriorbotwin.com. They can find me on Instagram at warriorbotwin7. I had to put the 7 there. I don't know why. And they can find me on Facebook. All they have to do is look my name up and they will find me.
Okay. I'll have those linked up at the show notes page at the traumatherapistpodcast.com. Shari, love having you on here. You have the key to come back whenever you want. And I sincerely mean that. And, if you want, I'm just speaking my thoughts here. If you want to talk about what it's like to write your book here, we can do that, whatever. I love having you on here. And thank you so much for being here again.
Thank you so much for having me and for all that you do for survivors around the world.
I appreciate that. All right. We'll be in touch.